At one of the wealthiest matchmaking firms in New York, a place where only the ultra-rich were ever welcome, a single father named Logan Hayes was turned away at the front door. Not because he couldn't afford the membership fee, but because the staff decided, within seconds of looking at him, that he simply didn't belong there. He was openly mocked in front of a lobby full of VIP clients and escorted outside without ceremony. He said nothing, and he left. But within hours, every executive at that agency was summoned to an emergency meeting they hadn't been warned about, and the most powerful woman in the business walked in with something unmistakably cold in her eyes. What none of them could have known was that the man they had just dismissed was the very reason they were all about to lose everything. Stay until the end, because the reversal you're about to witness will change the way you look at the people around you. Manhattan had a way of sorting people long before they ever opened their mouths, and nowhere was that sorting more deliberate, more ruthless, or more quietly celebrated than on the 32nd floor of a glass and steel tower in the financial district, where the city's most exclusive matchmaking agency had made its home. The streets in that part of the city had a different texture. The coffee cost more. The silences cost more. And the right introduction in the right lobby could shift the trajectory of a life more efficiently than a decade of work. It was in this particular corner of Manhattan that Elysian Match Group had constructed its reputation, not through advertising it didn't need to advertise, but through the kind of selective word of mouth that moved through boardrooms and charity galas and private members' clubs, always arriving with a weight attached to it. If you knew about Elysian, it meant you already belonged to the world in which Elysian was relevant, and that alone functioned as a form of gatekeeping more effective than any locked door. The woman behind all of it, the architect of the intake process, the client criteria, and the agency's carefully maintained reputation, was Evelyn Carter, who had transformed a boutique consulting practice into a full-scale luxury matchmaking operation before she turned 35. She was the kind of person who made other ambitious people nervous. Not through cruelty, but through precision, she moved through decisions the way surgeons moved through procedures, without sentiment and without hesitation. She believed, without irony, that love was a transaction like any other. That compatibility was a function of shared capital and aligned social networks, and she had built an entire institutional culture around this conviction. Every employee of Elysian moved through its marble hallways as an extension of that philosophy. Composed, controlled, and absolutely certain that their assessments of other people were correct. The agency's standards for client admission were not merely high, they were designed to feel like a form of distinction in themselves. A minimum verified net worth of $5 million, a background review that rivaled government clearance, and a social profile examined with the same methodical attention an auditor brought to a balance sheet. What had grown inside those offices, over years of careful cultivation, was a culture in which value was not something a person carried within them, but something they demonstrated through external evidence. And if you couldn't demonstrate it, within the first 30 seconds of walking through the person T-Day door, every clock in that building was already running against you. Logan Hayes had turned 28 the previous spring, and nothing about the way he moved through the world would have prepared anyone at Elysian for the reality of what he was. He lived in a clean, modest apartment in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that had been changing for years, without settling into either version of itself. Artisan bakeries, alongside hardware stores that had been there for 4 decades, each minding its own business. He drove a sedan that was several years old, maintained it himself on weekends because he liked understanding how things worked from the inside, and kept a savings account he updated monthly with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything else in his life. He had dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned early that most things resolve themselves faster when you stay out of their way. And every evening he cooked dinner for a 6-year-old girl named Aria, who had inherited both the eyes and the stillness, along with a precision of thought that surprised people who hadn't been warned. Aria was the center of everything Logan did, and anyone who spent more than a few minutes with him understood this without being told. Her mother had left when Arya was barely 2, not out of cruelty but out of a restlessness neither of them had ever been given a satisfying explanation for, and Logan had raised her alone in the years since without filling the space with bitterness. He read to her every night. He took her to the park on Saturday mornings and let her set the agenda. He helped with homework that was already somewhat advanced for a first grader, and he answered her questions with the seriousness they deserved, which was one of the things she responded to most. She was, by any measure that actually counted, thriving, and Logan understood, in the way he understood most things, which was quietly and completely, that what she needed most in the years ahead was not a bigger apartment or a better neighborhood, but a steadier version of the family she had been growing up without. That was the reason he had made an appointment with Elysian Match Group, not to find someone wealthy, not to climb any social structure, but to find a person who understood what it meant to build something slowly, who could sit at a kitchen table with a child, and feel the ease of it rather than the inconvenience. He had done his research before calling, and he came prepared in the way he prepared for everything. The file he carried into that office did not include photographs of property or documentation of a luxury vehicle. What it contained were signed contracts, documents bound by non-disclosure agreements with some of the largest technology firms in the country, along with a financial summary that, to anyone willing to read it carefully, described a man who had spent the better part of 5 years building something that people with 7-figure incomes would have envied without fully grasping. He had not publicized this. He had never seen a reason to. That decision, as it turned out, was the precise mechanism that would make everything that followed possible. The lobby of Elysian Match Group was exactly what it had been designed to be. A space that communicated immediately, without saying a word, that only certain people were meant to feel at ease there. The furniture was pale ash and geometrically precise. The lighting warm in the direction of objects rather than people, and the floral arrangement on the side table cost more per week than most people spent on groceries. Presiding over all of it from behind a curved glass desk was the receptionist, Madison Reed, who had been managing client intake for 2 years and had developed in that time a rapid visual assessment system she applied to every person who stepped off the elevator with a thoroughness that was genuinely impressive if you set aside the fact that it was also genuinely wrong. She clocked Logan the moment he appeared the unremarkable jacket, the absence of a watch that announced anything, the manila file folder in place of a leather portfolio, and had formed a complete opinion before he crossed half the lobby. She greeted him with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and shifted immediately into the particular register of someone who has already decided a conversation will be short. He gave his name, mentioned his appointment. Madison reviewed her screen with deliberate slowness, then asked him, in a tone of surface courtesy with a cooler substrate, to provide asset documentation before proceeding to intake. Logan had expected this. It was standard practice according to the firm's client information page, and he placed the folder on the desk without comment. Madison opened it, read for approximately 15 seconds, and set it back down. The issue, she explained, was that the financial documentation was not verifiable in the traditional sense. The contracts were real, she acknowledged, but sealed. The figures referenced were real, but they couldn't be cross-checked through standard channels. Elysian required transparency. A cluster of clients waiting nearby, 3 men and a woman, dressed in the precise way that communicated which side of the intake process they habitually stood on, had been watching with the casual interest of people with nothing more pressing to do, and one of them made a remark that was quiet enough to maintain the pretense of a private joke, but loud enough to carry. And another one laughed. And Madison did not intervene. Then Jason Cole walked in. He was 34, managed client relations for the agency's highest-tier accounts, and moved with the ease of someone who had been told he was good at his job, often enough that he no longer needed external confirmation. He surveyed the situation in seconds, approached the desk, and delivered what he clearly considered the authoritative close to a minor awkward situation. He told Logan, with a smile that was simultaneously polished and dismissive, that Elysian was not designed for clients whose financial history, and here he paused for effect required interpretation. He said Logan was welcome to seek services elsewhere. He gave a small nod to the security personnel positioned near the entrance, a signal the man responded to without hesitation, and Logan found himself being walked toward the elevator by someone who was not asking. The lobby returned to its ordinary rhythms before the elevator doors had finished closing, as if nothing of consequence had occurred which, to the people who remained in it, nothing had. What most of the people in that lobby would remember afterward was not what Logan said but what he did not say. He did not raise his voice or reach for his phone, or attempt to invoke his rights in the particular loud way that people sometimes do when they want to communicate grievance without admitting to hurt. He simply stopped just before the elevator and turned around, not with anger, not with wounded dignity, but with the unhurried calm of someone who has remembered a detail they meant to mention. He looked at Jason Cole, who was still standing near the desk with the satisfied posture of someone who had efficiently resolved a minor inconvenience, and said, "You should take a closer look at your evaluation system." Not a threat, not an ominous prediction, just a sentence delivered in the tone of a person who already knows how a story ends and simply doesn't feel the urgency to tell it yet. Cole let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Madison had already turned back to her screen. Logan stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and the lobby forgot him before the indicator light had moved one floor. Arya had been waiting in the car with the neighbor's daughter, a 17-year-old she had decided she liked, because the girl let her choose the music. Logan got in, buckled his seatbelt, and for a moment simply sat with his hands resting on the wheel while Arya, who had picked up on the specific quality of his silence, the way children always pick up on things before they have the vocabulary for them, studied him from the back seat. She asked, in the direct way she asked everything, whether he was sad. He thought about it before answering, which was something Arya had always noticed he did. He never answered a question faster than the answer deserved. He said no. She asked what had happened. He told her that the people in that building had looked at him and decided something that wasn't quite right, and that it wasn't their fault exactly, they just hadn't been given the right tools for looking. Arya considered this with the focused expression she brought to difficult puzzles, and then asked whether he was going to help them get the right tools. Logan looked at her in the rearview mirror for a moment and said he thought he probably already had. He drove home through early afternoon traffic without saying much more, but somewhere behind the quiet, the pieces of what needed to happen next had already begun arranging themselves, not out of anger and not out of any particular desire for resolution, but because something in the system had gotten badly wrong, and leaving it that way was simply not a choice he was willing to make. What Logan Hayes was the version of him that existed outside the Brooklyn apartment and the Saturday Park mornings and the nightly chapter books was something that precisely 4 people in the world understood in its full scope. Not the contracts, which more people had seen, not the income, which a handful of attorneys and accountants were aware of, but the specific nature of what he had built, and the specific role it played in the architecture of the city's most prestigious matchmaking agency that was known only to Logan himself, to the attorney who had negotiated the licensing terms, to the intermediary company that had handled the transaction, and to Eleanor Hayes, the AI-driven matchmaking platform that Elysian Match Group had been quietly and very profitably operating for the past 3 years. The system that had earned the agency a reputation for compatibility results the industry found difficult to explain had been designed and built in its entirety by Logan. He had spent the better part of 4 years constructing it, beginning with a theoretical framework he had developed during graduate research on behavioral compatibility modeling, and expanding it through hundreds of iterations, and an enormous number of hours into a functional platform that treated human compatibility not as a function of wealth or appearance, but as a pattern embedded in conversational data, disclosed values, long-term behavioral tendencies, and the kind of information people reveal about themselves only when they believe they are not being evaluated. Elysian had licensed the platform through a technology intermediary called Northgate Systems, a software licensing firm that existed, in functional terms, as a buffer between the agencies that used the platform and the individual who had created it. The arrangement was Logan's explicit preference. He had not wanted his name attached to the product in any public-facing capacity, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he valued the separation that allowed him to move through the world without being identified, and because he had understood even at the time of negotiation that anonymity was a form of protection that would, eventually, prove useful. The agreement granted Elysian a 10-year exclusive license in exchange for royalty payments that constituted, in aggregate, approximately 80% of the agency's total annual revenue. They had not fully grasped what they were purchasing. They had known only that it produced results that nothing else on the market could match. In the 3 years since the platform had gone live inside Elysian's operations, the agency's reputation for producing compatible long-term pairings had grown to a degree that industry analysts found genuinely difficult to account for. The success rate was high enough that clients began referring friends and colleagues without being asked, and within 18 months the agency had a waiting list that stretched 4 months into the future. Competitors had tried to reverse engineer the approach without success. Because what they were looking for in Elysian's public-facing process was not where the advantage lived. It lived in a set of mathematical relationships assembled by a man they had never heard of, and now, because someone inside the firm had quietly reached into that system and broken it for reasons that amounted to institutional vanity, the whole thing was at risk of unraveling in a very public way. What Logan had discovered in the weeks leading up to his appointment at the agency, and what had brought him there, in the end, with a file folder rather than an attorney, was that someone inside Elysian had been making modifications to the platform's weighting parameters. The changes were subtle enough to evade automatic alert protocols, but they were not accidental. Their effect was to skew the compatibility outputs in favor of clients whose net worth exceeded a certain internal threshold, overriding the behavioral markers, the value alignment indicators, and the long-term relationship data that the system had been built to identify. The algorithm he had spent years making honest had been quietly rewritten to do something fundamentally different, and he found this on a level that had nothing to do with revenue and everything to do with the integrity of the work itself, genuinely intolerable. He documented everything. Then he picked up his phone and called Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor Hayes was 61 years old, and she had the kind of authority that didn't announce itself. It simply occupied space and waited to be recognized. She had spent more than 3 decades building an investment portfolio that stretched across medical technology, commercial real estate, and early-stage venture capital, with a particular reputation for the kind of founder assessment that identified, in the earliest stages of a company's life, the difference between someone who would adapt under pressure and someone who would collapse under it. She was not warm in the way people sometimes expected warmth from women of her generation. She was precise and direct, and had a reputation for saying exactly what she meant in as few words as the situation required, which some people interpreted as coldness and others, more accurately, interpreted as a form of respect. She believed that wasting someone's time was a form of disrespect, and she extended this belief consistently, without exception. She was also, in a fact that had never been made public, and that existed in a category of things that simply didn't come up in conversation, Logan's mother. Their relationship was not estranged. It was private, in the way that relationships between two equally independent people can be private, when both of them have found a mutual language that requires very little translation and very few performances. She held a controlling stake in Elysian that was, like many things in her portfolio, not publicly disclosed. Logan called her from the apartment that evening. After Aria had been negotiated through bedtime and into her current chapter book, he opened his laptop while he talked, walking Eleanor through the documentation he had assembled, the parameter changes, the access timestamps, the specific modifications, and their projected effect on matchmaking output. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was her mode when something mattered. When he finished, there was a brief silence. He said yes to both. She told him she would schedule an emergency board meeting for the following morning. Not a conversation, not a review, but a full leadership meeting. Mandatory, and without explanation in the invitation. She said she would notify the agency's legal counsel. She then said, with a plainness that carried more weight than most people's most elaborately composed speeches, that what had happened to him in that lobby was unacceptable, and that she was sorry it had occurred. Logan told her she didn't need to apologize. She hadn't been the one at the reception desk. Eleanor said that was true, but that a company she had invested in had behaved that way toward a person she cared about, and that the distinction she was drawing was between personal responsibility and institutional responsibility, and that she held herself accountable for both. They said goodnight. Logan closed the laptop, looked out the window at the city's grid of lights, and let out a long breath that had been waiting most of the day to leave his chest. The summons went out at 7:45 the following morning calendar. Invitations that arrived without agenda, marked urgent, requiring confirmation within the hour. By 8:30, the main conference room on the 32nd floor was filling with people who were conveying their uncertainty in the various ways that professionals convey what they are not permitted to say out loud. Posture held slightly too rigid, phones consulted once too many times without any actual information being obtained. Glances exchanged across the table that asked and answered nothing. Evelyn Carter sat at the head of the room and held the stillness expected of a CEO, while privately confronting the particular species of uncertainty that belongs to situations whose full dimensions you cannot yet see. She had been notified by legal counsel at 7 that morning that the principal investor had personally requested an emergency board session, and she had spent the intervening time constructing and discarding scenarios, none of which arrived at a satisfying shape. The agency's financials were strong. Client metrics were positive. There had been no regulatory contact, no media exposure, nothing that mapped cleanly onto a crisis of this urgency. By the time she sat down at the conference table, she had concluded that whatever this was, it was something she hadn't been watching, and that the fact that she hadn't been watching it was itself information about a gap she would need to account for. Jason Cole arrived 3 minutes before the hour and took a seat 2 positions down from Evelyn with the relaxed posture of someone who believed himself to be a peripheral participant in whatever was unfolding. He had done a rapid internal review of his own recent conduct that morning and found nothing that warranted concern. The situation the previous day had been handled with professionalism. As far as he was concerned, a prospective client without verifiable documentation had been declined. The agency's standards had been upheld, and the floor had returned to normal without incident. He folded his hands on the table and waited with the quiet confidence of someone who expects to be watching someone else answer difficult questions. Eleanor Hayes walked in at exactly 10 o'clock, and the thing that happened in the room when she entered was not the result of any deliberate theater on her part. It was the involuntary response that rooms produce when someone walks in who carries authority at a cellular level. Everyone stood, not because they had been asked to, but because it seemed like the correct and obvious thing to do. Eleanor set her bag down, removed her coat, and looked around the table with the focused, unhurried attention of someone taking accurate inventory. She sat. Everyone sat. She opened a slim folder, looked up, and spoke. She said she was going to ask one question, and that she wanted an honest answer, and the quality of silence in the room confirmed that everyone present understood she was not applying the usual professional coatings to that request. She said, "Who made the decision to refuse a client at this agency yesterday morning?" The question landed without inflection, no implied accusation, no rhetorical warmth, just the question itself, exact and clear as a line drawn in ink. Jason Cole, operating from the conviction that transparency was the right play and that the right play would be recognized as such, straightened in his chair and said that he had. He said it with the confidence of someone who has done something he is prepared to defend. He had no idea that the act of raising his hand In that room, at that moment, was the first step in an ending he had not yet begun to write. Eleanor looked at Jason Cole for a moment without speaking, and the silence lasted just long enough to produce in everyone, watching a very specific discomfort, the kind that arrives in the space just before something irreversible is said. She then turned to the agency's head of operations, a woman named Patricia Walsh, and asked her to pull up the lobby camera footage from the previous morning between 9 and 9:30. Patricia pulled it within 90 seconds, because 6 years of working with Eleanor had taught her that speed and completeness were their own form of communication. The footage appeared on the conference room screen. The room watched. It ran for slightly over 4 minutes. The arrival, the reception desk exchange, the cluster of VIP clients beginning to comment among themselves, Cole's entrance and the brief exchange that followed, the nod to security, the walk to the elevator, and then the single sentence delivered quietly over one shoulder just before the doors closed. The footage was not dramatic in the way that the room might have prepared itself, for there were no raised voices, no visible confrontation, no moment that could be easily isolated and called out of context. What it showed was something subtler and in many ways harder to watch. A coordinated and entirely unconscious application of contempt, executed smoothly and without any apparent awareness that anything incorrect was happening. When it ended, the screen went dark. The room held the particular silence of people sitting with something they can no longer deny. Eleanor had not looked at the screen while the footage was running. She had looked at the faces around the table instead, tracking the micro-adjustments of expression that the viewing produced. When the footage ended, she looked back at the room and said, in a voice that had not shifted in register or volume since she had walked in, "The man in that footage is the reason this agency is profitable." She paused, not for effect but because precision required it. The platform that powers your matchmaking operations, the system that produces the results your clients pay a premium for, was built by him. He licensed it through Northgate Systems. He has never maintained a public profile in this industry. Most of you have been using his work every working day for 3 years without knowing what he looks like. The silence that followed this announcement had a different quality from the one that had preceded it. The first silence had been discomfort, and this one was recalculation. Across the table, the sounds of an entire room of professionals rapidly revising the story they had been telling themselves were audible in the absence of any sound at all. Evelyn Carter felt something cold move through her, that she would not have called fear. Exactly, but that was adjacent to it, the sensation of discovering that a situation you believed you controlled had dimensions you had never fully understood. She looked at Jason Cole. Cole was staring at the darkened screen, with the expression of a person who has discovered that what appeared to be solid ground is actually something else. The door opened. Logan Hayes walked in. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he had worn the previous morning. Clean. Unremarkable. Neither designed to impress nor to signal. He carried a tablet and a printed document that he set on the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent years presenting technical material to people who need to understand it without being technically trained. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the tiredness of someone who had been up early and had a list of things to do and was moving through them one at a time. He acknowledged Eleanor with a brief nod. He looked around the table once, briefly, in the way a person orients themselves in a new physical space, and then he directed his attention to the document in front of him and began to speak. His voice was level and unhurried and carried the specific authority that belongs to someone who knows the material they are presenting more completely than anyone in the room, not because they are performing knowledge, but because the knowledge is simply a fact. He said, "I want to walk through some modifications that were made to the matchmaking system over the past 6 weeks. Some of you are going to want to pay close attention." What Logan presented over the next 22 minutes was methodical and complete. He had organized the documentation chronologically, each unauthorized modification to the algorithm's weighting parameters laid out, with its date, its technical specifications, and its practical effect on the system's output. He used plain language, deliberately, not because the room lacked capacity for technical detail, but because plain language leaves no room for the kind of interpretive cushion that allows people to claim partial understanding. The modifications, he explained, had restructured the compatibility weighting to elevate financial net worth above every other variable, above the behavioral compatibility signals, above the disclosed value alignment data, above the long-term relationship tendency markers that the platform had been specifically designed to surface. In effect, someone had systematically reprogrammed the agency's most valuable and most central operational asset to do something fundamentally different from what it had been built to do. The result was that clients matched in the past 6 weeks who had reported dissatisfaction, there were 14 of them in the agency's own records, had in all likelihood been incorrectly matched, not because the system had failed, but because the system had been altered. He named the access log timestamps. He identified the user credentials used to execute the changes. He placed the printed documentation at the center of the table, where every person present could see it, and then he stopped and waited. Eleanor spoke first. She looked at the agency's legal counsel and said she wanted Jason Cole placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a formal review, and that the review should proceed as a termination unless new information materially changed the picture. She said this without raising her voice, without visible anger, with the same directness she brought to every decision, as if the weight of the situation was self-evident and required no additional tone to communicate. Then she turned to Evelyn Carter and said that the degree to which these modifications had gone undetected for 6 consecutive weeks represented a management failure, and that she expected a formal account of the oversight gap within 48 hours. Evelyn nodded. There was nothing else available to her. Logan then named 3 conditions under which he would allow the licensing agreement through Northgate to remain active rather than invoking the breach of contract termination clauses the modifications had technically triggered. The first was full restoration of the original algorithm, certified by independent technical review within 72 hours. The second was the elimination of the agency's asset-based intake screening policy. The general financial stability criterion could remain as a broad guideline, but it could no longer function as an automatic disqualifier or as the basis for how prospective clients were treated during intake. The third was mandatory retraining for all client-facing personnel, reviewed and approved by an external consultant of Logan's choosing. He said these were not negotiable and that he did not need an answer in the room. He needed it in writing by the following morning. He picked up the tablet and the printed document, and he walked out. Evelyn Carter did not sleep well that night, and this was not something she was accustomed to. She had built her professional identity in significant part on resilience, the capacity to absorb setbacks, recalibrate quickly, and return to form without carrying the previous day's damage into the next morning. But what had happened in the conference room was not a setback in the ordinary sense. It was a correction, and corrections demanded acknowledgement rather than recalibration, which was a different and harder thing, and one she had considerably less practice with. She lay awake thinking about the footage, not the business exposure it represented, not the liability calculus, but the footage itself, the 4 minutes of ordinary contempt that people she had hired and trained had delivered without apparent hesitation. She had been so focused on building a culture of excellence that she had not stopped to examine what the word meant to the people she had built it with, or whether the standards she had set for worth had leaked, quietly and without announcement, into standards for how human beings deserved to be treated. She requested a private meeting with Logan 2 days after the board session. He chose a coffee shop in Brooklyn, a small, warm place near Arya's school, where the staff knew him by name, and the menu was written in chalk on a board behind the counter. Evelyn arrived early and sat with a coffee she wasn't tasting. Feeling the displacement that comes from being in someone else's neighborhood when you are accustomed to environments you have designed. Logan arrived on time, sat across from her without ceremony, and ordered tea with the ease of someone in their natural element. Evelyn began with an apology that she had deliberately not scripted, because scripted apologies carry the texture of performance, and she wanted him to hear something honest, even if honest was harder to execute. She said that what had happened in her agency's lobby was wrong, that it reflected a culture she had been instrumental in building, and that she was sorry. Logan listened to all of it before responding. He told her he accepted the apology, and that he had not agreed to the meeting to receive it, but because he believed, based on what he had seen in that conference room, that she was genuinely capable of changing what needed to change. He said this not as encouragement, but as an assessment evaluated and delivered in the same register he brought to technical reviews. He said the problem in her agency was not that the individual employees were malicious, because most of them were not, but that the culture had been built in a way that made contempt feel like professionalism, and that was a design problem, which meant it was fixable. He said he hoped she would fix it. Evelyn wrote down what he said. Over the following 3 months, Elysian underwent a restructuring of its intake process, comprehensive enough to require external consultation, and painful enough to demand, from Evelyn personally, a sustained act of will. The asset threshold was reframed as a broad financial stability criterion rather than a bright-line admission gate. The intake staff underwent retraining that examined not just procedure, but the assumptions underneath procedure. Logan's original algorithm was fully restored and recertified by an independent technical reviewer within the promised 72 hours, and the new version went live on schedule. Logan did not return to Elysian in any official capacity. The licensing agreement stayed in place through Northgate. The royalties continued on schedule, and the system he had built continued to do what it had always done best: surface patterns of compatibility between people who hadn't yet found those patterns in themselves. He had left, in the form of the restructured platform and the updated matching criteria, something that would outlast whatever role he might have played if he'd chosen formal involvement. That felt right to him. He was not, by disposition or by preference, someone who needed his name on the work. The work was enough. He returned to the life he had before the appointment, the Brooklyn apartment, the Saturday mornings in the park, the evenings spent reviewing contracts and reading to Arya before bed. The city moved around him with its usual indifferent grandeur, and Logan moved through it with the same quality of unhurried attention he had always brought to the things that were genuinely his. He was offered, through various intermediaries, 3 separate consulting arrangements in the months that followed, companies that had absorbed, in the imprecise and fragmented way that information travels through industries, some version of what had transpired, and wanted proximity to whatever it was he apparently understood. He declined all 3. He had enough. He was, by every measure that felt meaningful to him, where he wanted to be. It was Arya who asked the question. On a Saturday morning in early spring, while they were eating breakfast, and the kitchen windows were open for the first time to genuinely warm air, she had been thinking about the story he had given her, the shape of it, simplified but honest, because she had a right to the outline even if she didn't need every detail, and she asked, with the directness that had always been entirely and specifically hers, whether he had won. Logan held his coffee in both hands and thought about it the way he thought about every question worth answering, as though it deserved more than the first response that presented itself. He said that winning wasn't quite the right word for what had happened. He said it was more like fixing something that had been broken, something that wasn't his in any strict legal sense anymore, but that he had built and therefore felt a continuing responsibility for, the way you feel responsible for a structure you've made even after it passes into someone else's hands. Arya considered this with her particular expression of focused evaluation. She said that sounded like winning to her, just with more steps. Logan laughed a real laugh, the kind that surprised him by how much it needed to happen, and said she wasn't wrong. Elysian Match Group did not become a different kind of place overnight. The world it served was not a world that changed easily or completely, and the people who moved through its renovated intake process still arrived with all of the assumptions that certain kinds of privilege install early and maintain quietly. But what had taken root in those restructured rooms, in the recalibrated algorithm, in the shift in how Evelyn Carter now asked questions she had once been too certain to ask, was something real. It was the difference between a system that sorted people and a system that tried to understand them. And while the distance between those two things was not always visible from the outside, it was enormous from within. Logan hadn't asked anyone to abandon their values or dismantle their world. He had simply made it difficult enough to stay the same that changing became the more practical choice. And in a city built on the principle that everything could be measured, priced, and positioned accordingly, that quiet insistence that human value was not reducible to any single variable amounted to its own kind of correction. Small, without ceremony, exactly the kind Logan had always preferred.